board. Okay, so welcome to Writers in Progress reading on last Thursday in March. Tonight we are featuring writers from a couple of our weekly workshops who have been writing with us for a while. We have Wendy, Vowell, Harriet, Trenholm, and Sarena, Neyman, who are all reading tonight. I've had the pleasure of writing with all three of these writers, and it's been wonderful. And, you know, we keep doing these readings, even though we're on Zoom and it's not quite the same as being in person, but we are going to have some in-person ones coming up as well. I think regardless, you know, there are pros and cons to both formats. And the main thing is just that we get to come together and share our work and hear each other with a slightly broader audience, because that's really part of what we do as writers is to reach out, you know, like there's a lot of our work that happens in isolation, as many of you know and have experienced. The writing groups are wonderful because they break that isolation and bring people together to do this work that can otherwise feel very lonely. And it's always such a joy during our weekly groups to hear people's work read aloud and to share our stories with one another. So the readings are just a way to kind of expand that to a slightly larger audience. And there's a couple of quotes that I wanted to share with you here. This one is from Sue Monk Kidd, her book, The Secret Life of Bees. She says, "Stories have to be told or else they die. And when they die, we can't remember who we are or why we're here." And here's another one from the writer Kristen Noel. "With every story stuffed away, we bypass the chance to expand and to connect. A missed opportunity slipped through our fingers." So we come together to share this work to reach each other, you know, to alleviate some of the isolation of writing and of living, and to learn from one another's stories. And we have some really great, interesting stories tonight. So without any further ado, I'm going to start with our first reader, who's Wendy Vowell. Wendy is in my Tuesday morning group. She's been there for a little while now. It's been such a pleasure to have her. After a career in three-dimensional marketing, Wendy Vowell recently retired to write full-time. She now calls herself a hobby historian, but more recently, she added to her resume the title Certified National Archives Researcher. I love that. Sounds so official. Wendy is currently working on her third book entitled Grandma Leaf and the Boy Who Was Not There. The historical biography is about the relationship between Gertrude Leaf and her son Harold after Harold was lost at sea in a submarine in 1944. Gertrude never gave up hope that he would someday come home. From Groton, Connecticut to Portland, Oregon, Wendy searches recently declassified war documents in order to capture the essence of Harold Leaf, the boy who wasn't there. So welcome, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Dory. The essay I'm about to read is based on a World War II biography in progress. In this excerpt, Harold Leaf, our young sonar tech, is on his first war patrol aboard a diesel-powered submarine called the Greyback. To set the scene, the Greyback departed Brisbane, Australia on April 25th, 1943, with a crew of 80 men. It's now May 11th, and Harold is about to experience his first submarine battle. What the instructors at submarine school didn't explain was the sonar didn't always work the way it was supposed to. They didn't tell Harold that his heart would sometimes pound in his ears so loud he couldn't hear anything else. They didn't tell him how the headphones made his ears sweat, almost sliding off his head. They didn't tell him how intense it was to lean into the sounds, to filter the background noise, including those from his own boat. It was Harold's duty to sniff out enemy ships. He was supposed to locate and recognize every vessel within range of the sonar equipment. Then he was supposed to alert his superiors. What he wasn't told was that he was responsible for the safety of every man aboard the Grayback. Harold was surprised by the stress of a 4-hour shift spent hunched over the sonar's green magic eye. It was his only view of the world outside. He hadn't expected the ache in his shoulders and neck, the way his teeth clenched halfway through the shift. What he couldn't have predicted was the way his nails dug into his palms when he heard torpedoes in the water on the way to an enemy ship. Was he jubilant when a torpedo hit the target and exploded? Was he supposed to celebrate with the crew? Or maybe he should have said a quiet prayer, a tiny funeral for the men lost in the ensuing inferno. Did Harold feel guilty for his misplaced moral compass? What happened to all those Sunday school lessons from his childhood? Where were they now? At first, the game of cat and mouse was initiated by the Grayback as the cat. The enemy ship was the mouse. The Grayback fired 4 torpedoes, all raced toward the enemy, trailing a wake of bubbles right back to the sub. At that point, the Grayback became the mouse. The enemy patrol boat became the cat. Dive, dive, the Grayback commander barked. The order was passed, forward to aft, and the boat began to sink. Conversations ceased. The men stared at gauges. The sonar picked up engine noise above. 16-cylinder diesels hammered overhead. Japanese patrols, 3 of them, Harold announced. Patrol boats fought back with depth charges. They dropped them like 500-pound hand grenades into the water. Rig for depth charges, the commander barked. Every submariner hated and feared depth charges. The Grayback reached 250 feet deep and leveled off. The commander announced, rig for silent running. Nobody said a word. The card game and mess stopped. Every man not on duty clambered into his berth. The cook stopped what he was doing. Dirty dishes and trash could wait. It was all too noisy. Harold's feet were glued to the deck in front of the sonar equipment. His hands trembled. The area was dark and dank, too small for all the men working there. He would have loved to go topside. He wanted to breathe fresh salt air. He couldn't even light a cigarette in this ultra-quiet time. Harold listened for the enemy. The enemy pinged and listened for the Grayback. Harold filtered out ocean sounds with buttons and dials. Ping, ping went the enemy sonar as it searched for the Grayback. Harold's sonar swept the screen in search of enemy bearings. Ping, ping went the enemy. Harold's lip trembled. He turned the dials again. He counted enemy propeller RPMs for speed. Splash, something fell into the water above. There was an explosion nearby, followed by 3 more louder. The Grayback rocked. Patrol boats circled closer. 2 more explosions banged. It sounded like sledgehammers pounded against the hull. The deck shook like an earthquake. A light bulb shattered to Harold's left. Cork insulation fell in his hair. Harold's breath quickened. Sweat dripped from his nose and cheeks. The depth charges tapered off and stopped. Surface engine noises edged away. After a while, the Japanese seemed to be gone. The Grayback returned to 50 feet depth. After a periscope sighting, the commander announced, all clear, but it wasn't all clear for Harold. His body was still pumping out adrenaline. Harold was still wired on too much coffee and cigarettes. There was no place to exercise or run. He couldn't go for a swim. The only thing he could do was hang out in the mess and talk about what just happened. Every man had a different experience based on various duty stations. When they talked, they pieced the story together like a patchwork quilt. The conversation might have sounded like this. From the lookout, I knew we were in for it when I saw all that smoke on the horizon. That was more Jap ships than I've ever seen in one place. From the plainsman, when commander said dive, he meant crash dive. I couldn't get the boat down fast enough. Torpedo man, Halverson, I've never seen you load a torpedo that fast. We got our time down to 19 minutes. Halverson, good thing we cleaned and oiled all the torpedoes last night. I didn't think we needed them for a couple days. Harold, those depth charges scared me to death. I thought sure we were a goner. Lookout, nah, the Japs set the depth charges to go off at 50 or 100 feet. As long as we get below that, we're good. Besides, an explosion in the water always goes up, not down. We just stay below the explosion. Harold and his mates might have soothed their nerves with a nip of depth charge medicine, usually brandy or whiskey from the commander's private stash. Or Harold fielded the torpedo room for something more potent. Torpedo motors used 180 proof grain alcohol for fuel. Early in the war, torpedo men learned to siphon off some of the alcohol. They mixed it with 2 parts alcohol and 3 parts pineapple juice and drank it. Codename torpedo juice. The rumor mill said the admirals got wind of it. To keep the guys from stealing the torpedo fuel, some big shot came up with the idea to add 5% methanol and pink dye. Methanol was bad stuff. It could cause blindness. The pink dye identified it as treated alcohol to keep the thieves out of it. The guys started calling it Pink Lady. But here's the thing. Submariners were exceptionally bright. They were also young and stupid. The kids thought they could filter the Pink Lady through a loaf of bread to remove the methanol. If Pink Lady thieves were less judicious, there wouldn't be enough fuel for a long torpedo run. With a full tank, maximum torpedo range was about 4,500 yards. A torpedo fuel shortage literally forced the submarine into close combat. When the firing range was less than 2,000 yards, the hit rate improved. The closer the battle, the more stress on the men. The greater the stress, the more alcohol they pilfered. That was life on a submarine. Thank you.
Whoops, I was muted. That was amazing, Wendy.
Thank you.
Torpedo juice. Don't try that at home, anyone. Wow, that was incredible. What a great reading. Okay, let me find my notes here. Make sure you write any questions that you have for Wendy or comments in the chat bar. I'm really glad not to have been a submariner in that war. Whew. Okay, the next reader is Harriet. Harriet Trenholm believes firmly in the value of reading because people who can read can learn pretty much everything else they need to know. She also values independence and self-actualization, and she prefers cats to dogs. So from the Monday night workshop, welcome, Harriet. Oops, you're muted, Harriet.
You can't hear me?
I can now.
Okay. This is a short personal narrative about having children. Consider the following 2 statements. The happiest people on earth are childless, and the happiest people on earth have children. Like any other directives, without a word like most or some, both of these statements have to be false. Personally, I never wanted to have children. When people used to ask me why I didn't want to have children, I always wondered if they asked others why they did want to have children. Now, when I am asked this question by people who are not seriously trying to understand my reasons, my answer is usually, why would I want to invite a total stranger into my house for 18 years? But of course, that's not a real answer. When they hear I don't like children, many people assume that I don't want children. Many people assume that I don't like children. They would be wrong. I do love children, but I'll be honest, I don't really love babies. I love children starting at an age that drives many others crazy, the terrible 2s. However, I would rename those years the coming into their own and developing independence 2s. There are enough children around for me to love. I love teaching preschool, and although I've taught students from preschool to graduate school to adults, preschool students were always my favorite. Even though they sometimes threw up on my shoes, which the graduate students and adults never did, I loved preschool children due to their enthusiasm for learning and their pride in their growing abilities. But as much as I loved them, I loved being able to send them home to someone else at the end of the day. I also had nephews I could love. And although I always told my brother I was going to tell his kids that Daddy was going to buy them a pony as soon as I left, I never really said it. I did, however, leave. I made the decision to be childless when I was 4 years old. Not really an appropriate age at which to make such a monumental decision. My decision was based on the fact that I did not want to be a parent if all parents were like mine. I found out later, of course, that my decision was based on a false premise. I could have changed my mind at any point, but even as I grew older, I still didn't want to have children of my own. I graduated from college in 1970, back when everyone more or less took it for granted that life would include a house with a white picket fence, 2.5 children, and a dog. I never took that for granted. I did, however, take for granted that life would include a spouse. In all fairness, I told my college boyfriend I didn't want to have children. He agreed. We got married. He informed me that he knew I'd change my mind once we were married. I didn't. We divorced. I didn't and don't need a husband or children to be happy. I love my work. I love my solitude and downtime when I got home from work. I love solitude and downtime so much that I never got married again, although I did live with someone for years. To me, marriage meant that any government agency could view me as half of a couple. But I don't want to be half of a couple. I want to be an individual. I wanted to keep my finances separate. I wanted to be able to leave without any rules about community property or having to justify my decision to anyone other than the person I was living with. In fact, while I was cohabitating, I frequently told people we were not married, so the government couldn't designate my relationship as a common law marriage. With my next boyfriend, a boyfriend who has lasted for over 30 years, I knew myself well enough to know I'd never want to cohabitate with anyone. Both boyfriends wanted to get married, but I didn't. And in my defense, let me mention that research has shown that in general, married men are happier than unmarried ones, and unmarried women are happier than married ones. So if you think you'll need children to care for you in your old age, there are plenty of very nice independent living, assisted living, and memory care facilities. With all those years of working and not having the expenses of raising children, you'll have enough money to choose an extremely nice facility on your own. And that sounds very good to me.
It's too late for me, I'm afraid, Harriet. But that was very fun. I love that feisty narrator. Thank you so much. Okay. Our last reader is Sarena Neyman, who lives in Leverett, Massachusetts. Serena's in the Friday morning group. She has been for a couple of years, I think. It's been a total pleasure to have her. Sarena helps advocates for social change articulate their causes through her business, which is called Night Owl Grant Writing. She has played a writing role in several key battles for digital rights, marriage equality, and affordable housing. And she's now in the process of writing and rewriting fabulous, I may add, personal essays for her collection, which she is going to call Notes from a Loving Curmudgeon. So welcome, Sarena.
All right. Thank you. This is called Attention to Detail. Every job on the planet demands that you be detail-oriented. And who would ever admit that they're not? It may be one step up from saying you drink too much. Yeah, I don't really pay attention to details. They're too boring. It's not worth my time to be painstakingly careful. Sorry. Truth is, we're not all detail-oriented people, or DOPEs, as I like to call them. Some of us just tend to cut corners more than others. We're just not wired to be super careful about things. I, for one, am ready to shed my shame about not being a DOPE, along with the fact that I'm not a morning person. The two seem connected somehow. In fact, the world would probably be a safer and saner place if more people admitted to needing to be double-checked about needing someone to catch their public pubics, a term I coined after waxing so eloquently about pubic housing in the widely distributed Housing Authority annual report. Also, I should clarify, it's not that I'm not detail oriented. It's just that the details I tend to care about are not necessarily the same as yours. Your important details might lie in how you load your dishwasher or in making sure the numbers add up on your tax filings. Mine might be more like knowing that my ideal heel size is 1.75 inches, or that the perfect green for my exterior trim is Benjamin Moore's blue-leaning manor green rather than the yellow-leaning rainforest. I also want to note that one should never assume having a detailed-oriented person for the job is always a plus. The DOPE, by virtue of her over-attentiveness to minutia, is sometimes like a camera permanently set up only to take close-ups. Not so good for the breathtaking mountain shots. Sometimes you want to have big picture people working for you rather than pointillists. People who are not detail-oriented people also tend to move a little faster. That's why we don't like paying attention to details. They can really slow you down. That careful tallying and retallying, noting things down you need to remember, going over the set checklist of things you need to make sure are in your bag before you leave. Every time you give even the smallest bit of attention to details, you are adding seconds or even minutes that can feel excruciatingly long to a non-detail oriented person. Of course, there's no getting around that some jobs are better suited for detail-oriented people. Surgeons, accountants, airline pilots, to name a few. But in filling these jobs, how will you really know if someone's detail-oriented, since no one will admit to not being one? I've always been a fan of using trick questions when hiring people, because otherwise you'll just learn how good your prospect is at answering interview questions. Here are some of my suggested questions. Number 1, do you enjoy bird watching? Most detail-oriented people don't, or at least I don't. 2, how do you rate yourself as a gift wrapper? We non-DOPers are big fans of the gift bag. Number 3, have you ever cooked anything from the Silver Palette cookbook where each recipe has at least 25 ingredients? This should be self-explanatory. I worry that as I get older, I will need to become the detailed-oriented person I am not. As your memory and sight go, you have to stay on top of details. You have to put things back where they belong. You got to keep lists of things. I've started logging each book I read. Otherwise, things suddenly seem too familiar after I've already read half a book. I can no longer place my keys in my pocket or in a random bag I'm carrying in from the car. My keys now always live on a hook in the garage. My husband, who does all the cooking, thank God, because recipes are so tiresome, tries to keep me in line. He installed the hook, and he also puts the fear of God in me, as I suspect if he were ever to divorce me, it would be because of all the time I make him wait in the car just as we're about to take off, because I just remembered I forgot my phone, which is usually in my bag, but I only find that out after running back into the house. I no longer forget my phone too often. Maybe as I get older, there will be fewer details to chase and nail down, fewer events on the calendar, fewer budgets to review or typos to catch. Maybe then I can truly embrace my lack of love of detail and relax into my big picture spaciness and contemplate the difference between Hunter and Essex green, or read a book all over again and not even notice.
That was great, Sarena. I don't think I've heard that one before. What a treat that was. Oh my gosh. Okay. Somebody asked if you do stand up, Sarena. Have you ever done that?
No,
It might be a new career.
yeah.
Add it to your bucket list.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. That was really fun. What great entertaining pieces you all read tonight. And I thought we could just, have a little conversation about writing and some of the questions that came up in the chat bar too. So one thing that I wanted to start with is just somebody asked, I think it was Julie, how people deal with writer's block. But I wanted to just widen that question up a little bit and say, like, what for each of you, what's the hardest thing about writing? Is it writer's block? Is it confidence? Is it scheduling? Let's just go around and hear briefly from each of you. Wendy, you want to go first?
I'll go first. I am going to say my hardest challenge has been, I'm writing a chronological story, but I'm finding the facts in a nonlinear way. So I first discovered the end of the story, then I discovered the beginning of the story, and now I'm trying to figure out all the stuff in the middle, but I'm keeping writing. So that's been my hardest challenge.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask, I mean, someone else, I think in the chat bar asked how you go about ordering your research too. Like I see all those notes, those sticky notes on the back of your wall there.
That's 2 walls of timeline. You're only seeing about 3 feet of it. It takes up about 12 feet right now.
Wow. So I have another specific question for you around that, which is how do you avoid getting just absolutely like sucked into the research rabbit hole so that that's all you spend your time doing when you're writing? Do you discipline yourself to, okay, I'm only going to spend this much time on research and then I have to do this much writing, or how do you manage it?
I try and limit myself to anything that's directly related to the character. If it isn't going to impact the character, then I don't particularly want to know. There's a certain amount of micro and versus macro events, macro events, for instance, the World War II and Navy battles, etc. But I don't need to know about every single battle on every single island. I'm trying to confine my research to anything that actually touched the lives of the characters I deal with. So it's a fine line. It's difficult, and the pile of books in my office and has been growing every week.
I'm thinking about tackling a historical novel after the memoir that I'm working on, and I'm really intimidated by the idea of researching. It takes place during the Revolutionary War and afterwards. And do you have any advice for someone like me who's thinking about taking on a topic like that I know nothing about? Like,
I would start with figuring out where your story is going to take place and first focus on what that character knew. Forget the character didn't know anything that would be on CNN or Fox News. They only knew what was word of mouth in that particular village or maybe in a newspaper, and that's all they knew. They didn't even have telephone. They didn't have telegraph.
yeah.
So if
That's
the writer can focus specifically on what touched that character, it helps.
That's great advice. Thank
I
you.
sometimes think too that reading other people kind of helps put an idea in the sense of looking at some other historical things from that time period, either fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah.
Just because sometimes it can focus. I mean, not that you want to turn into that person, but it can sometimes give ideas.
That's great advice too. Harriet, let's move to you. What's the most challenging thing to you about writing and how do you deal with it?
Okay, basically discipline is difficult because, to write, you have to sit down there with your paper and pencil. Could use a computer, but I like paper and pencil and then read it into my computer. Also, there's some difficulty for me in the fact that I never know if what I'm writing is any good or not. If anybody would want to hear it, why I would want to write it, somebody else has already said it, that sort of thing. And sort of overcoming that critique of why do you think you should even be doing this?
Mhm.
I think is sometimes a problem for me.
Yeah, that is a big one. And I think we all face that, right? Is this any good? Does anyone care? And that reminds me of the quote, Sarena, that you asked about the other day. And I forgot to email it to you that Emily had put it on our Facebook page, our Writers in Progress page. And I think the quote was, a writer's job is to outlast doubt. And that just seems like so spot on to me. So is there anything that helps you with that?
Well, I think that's one of the things that that Writers in Progress does for me, in the sense that I really enjoy the workshops where not only do you write, but you get to hear other writers, and sort of the fact that everybody has a different voice. Sometimes I'm a little bit jealous of somebody's voice. It's more literary, it's more, it has more imagery, whatever it is. But when you listen to enough people read, then it's like, oh, my voice is my voice. It doesn't have to be anybody else's voice, because it couldn't be anyway. But just being satisfied with that, listening to so many people read, I think sort of puts that in a perspective for me. And plus feedback of what's working kind of is a little boost to the fact that, oh, maybe this isn't a total waste of energy.
That's great. I agree with what you just said, because I think, it's not just getting the positive feedback on what's working in your piece in the workshops, but also like hearing everybody's work and understanding that, like, oh, wow, everyone has an interesting story to tell, right? That's uniquely theirs, or that nobody else could tell in quite the same way. And I think there's something about being in a group that really brings that home, right? That Martha Graham quote about how our only job is to really bring forth what's within us, right? Or what's, what only we can tell, or in the way that we can tell it. So thank you for that. Sarena, how about you? What's your biggest challenge with writing, and how do you deal with it?
I think my biggest challenge is that I'm privileged enough to have lived a pretty banal life. I haven't had any crises or, real painful experiences. So I feel sometimes like, who cares, But I think the way I get over that is the feeling that I'm not necessarily writing for a million people. I'm just kind of writing for myself and for maybe my immediate family who will read this. And I think that just doing this stuff makes you think like a writer, makes you look at what you're experiencing through a lens of kind of curiosity and like needing to figure out really noticing it and being able to describe it. And so for me, I feel like writing is, whether it gets published or anything more than that, is payment in of itself, just the process.
I love that. That's beautiful. And I think it was, I'm sorry, I keep bringing up quotes, but part of what I do every week is find quotes from my writers. So this Marcel Proust quote keeps popping into my head, but I can't remember the exact wording, but it was about, writers not necessarily needing to have trauma in order to have a story to tell. And in fact, he had a very ordinary bourgeois life, right? And he really kind of threw a wrench in that idea that in order to have something to write about, you had to have drama and trauma, and yeah. And for those of us who who did have kind of traumatic upbringings, it's hard to then write about anything else, and that's a challenge too for me. Does anyone else in our audience want to chime in about this conversation about what's hard about writing or what gets you through it?
About things being good. A lot of people love to read about things that are working and things that don't have crises.
Yes.
So you shouldn't necessarily think it's, oh, there's nothing exciting. Sometimes just a picture. I think for people like me who had an unpleasant background, the idea of other worlds, there's other ways people live. It doesn't have to be like this. So I would certainly value anything that was about good stuff too.
Absolutely. I think one of the one of the values of the groups for me too is just seeing that, that one person can be writing about, escaping an abusive relationship, but someone else is writing about their weird relationship with their cat. And depending on the voice and the language, it can be just as riveting, so it really is about, how you tell it rather than how exciting the material is.
Could I chime in?
Yeah, Kate.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, one of the biggest challenges is getting that gremlin off your shoulder that's always telling you it's no good, you're not good enough, nobody cares to hear about this, blah, 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 blah. Sort of cutting you off at the knees before you even manage to sit down at the desk.
Yes.
So, the ways that we manage to shut that voice up so that our real inner voice can come out are really, I think they're different for different people. But I do think it's a challenge for everybody.
Yeah.
Hey, you're bringing up a really good point, and I think that's the beauty of the Writers in Progress workshops. It's a safe space that I feel I can be vulnerable, and I can share that vulnerability and not feel criticized. I get positive feedback and positive reinforcement from those workshops, and I come away feeling like I know where the next steps are. I understand where the weaknesses are, but I also understand there's a lot of strong points in the work. And that's what I get from these workshops.
Thank you, Wendy. Dawn, were you going to say something?
Well, for me, the hard thing is being consistent, just to sit down. Normally, my schedule is such that I sit down at 9 and work till lunchtime. And if something happens and I don't sit down till, I'm not done till 10, it's really hard to force myself to sit down. What I've discovered, though, is that if I at least do like one paragraph, even if it's just a paragraph, I get something done, then it's okay to quit, even if it only took like 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I find that if I can get one paragraph done, then by the time I get through that paragraph, I want to keep going usually.
Yeah.
Not always, but usually by the time I get like 300 or 400 words down, then I'm hooked. And it's like, it was really just the journey, to get the butt in the chair that was so hard. But once you're engaged, once you start doing the work, then the work draws you in, and those voices of self-doubt that tell you that you suck, have a tendency to fall away once you're engaged. So I think for me, that's the only cure for those voices that you were talking about, Kate. It's just doing it, just getting back into the story. So it's so much fun to see you all tonight. And thank you to our 3 readers. Those were terrific pieces. Really fun to hear and entertaining. And thanks for everybody who showed up tonight. If you're interested, we have a bunch of great workshops this spring, so you can check it out on our website, writersinprogress.com. Feel free to email me with any questions too. And the next reading event that we're having is we're celebrating Steve Bernstein. His self-published book, Stories from the Stoop, got picked up by Simon & Schuster, and they're going worldwide with it. It's going to be a big debut. And so we're having an online launch party for him on April 8th at 4:30. It's a Saturday afternoon. And then on May 2nd, I'm really excited to have an in-person event at the studio. Megan Tatey, who was in my workshops for years, got a book contract with Zibby Books, and her first novel is coming out on May 2nd. So we're launching her at the studio. Everybody's welcome, and I hope to see some of you there in person. Until then, or until I see you, thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great night.